Section 6 of Highways and Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. I walked into the front office with a lot of self-assurance. The medical center was a big, rambling place with a lot of spread-out 1- and 2-story buildings that looked so much like hospital that no one in the world would have mistaken them for anything else. The main building was by the road. The rest spread out behind as far as I could see. Beyond my Esper range, even though the whole business was set in one of the clearest psi areas I'd even been in. I was only mildly worried about telepaths. In the first place, the only thing I had to hide was my conviction about a secret organization and how part of it functioned. In the second place, the chances were good that few, if any, telepaths were working there, if the case of Dr. Thorndyke carried any weight. That there were some telepaths I did not doubt, but these would not be among the high-powered help. So I sailed in and faced the receptionist, who was a good-looking chemical-type blonde with a pale skin, lovely complexion, and figure to match. She greeted me with a glacial calm and asked my business. Brazenly, I lied. I'm a freelance writer, and I'm looking for material. Have you an assignment? She asked, without a trace of interest in the answer. Not this time. I'm strictly freelance. I like it better this way because I can write whatever I like. Her glacial air melted a bit at the inference that my writing had not been in vain. Where have you published? She asked. I made a fast stab in the dark, aiming in a direction that looked safe. Last article was one on the latest archaeological findings in Assyria. Got my source material direct from the Oriental Institute in Chicago. Too bad I missed it, she said, looking regretful. I had to grin. I'd carefully avoided giving the name of the publication and the supposed date. She went on, I suppose you would not be happy with the usual press release? Handouts contain material, all right, but they're so confounded trite and impersonal. People prefer to read anecdotes about the people rather than a listing of facts and figures. She nodded at that. Just a moment, she said. Then she addressed her telephone in a voice that I couldn't hear. When she finished, she smiled in a warmish-type manner as if to indicate that she'd gone all out in my behalf and that I'd be a heel to forget it. I nodded back and tried to match the toothpaste ad smile. Then the door opened and a man came in briskly. He was a tall man, as straight as a ramrod, with a firm jaw and a close-clipped mustache. He had an air like a thin man's Captain Bligh. When he spoke, his voice was as clipped and precise as his mustache. In fact, it was so precise that it seemed almost mechanical. I am Dr. Lyon Sprague, he clipped. What may I do for you? I'm Steve Cornell, I said. I'm here after source material for a magazine article about Mekstrom's disease. I'd prefer not to take my material from a handout. Do you hope to get more? He demanded. I usually do. I've seen your handouts. I could get as much by taking last year's medical encyclopedia. Far too dry, too uninteresting, too impersonal. Just exactly what do you have in mind? I eyed him with speculation. Here was not a man who would take kindly to imaginative conjecture. So Dr. Lyon Sprague was not the man I'd like to talk to. With an inward smile, I said, I have a rather new idea about Mekstroms that I'd like to discuss with the right party. He looked down at me, although our eyes were on the same level. I doubt that any layman could possibly come up with an idea that has not been most thoroughly discussed here among the research staff. In cold words, you feel that no untrained lunk has a right to have an idea? He froze. I did not say that. You implied, at least, that suggestions from outsiders were not welcome. I begin to understand why the medical center has failed to get anywhere with Mekstroms in the past 20 years. What do you mean? He snapped. merely that it is the duty of all scientists to listen to every suggestion and to discard it only after it has been shown wrong. Such as, he said coldly, with a curl of his eyebrows. Well, just for instance, suppose some way were found to keep a victim alive during the vital period, so that he would end up a complete Mekstrom human. The idea is utterly fantastic. We have no time for such idle speculation. There is too much foggy thinking in the world already. Why, only last week we had a Velikovsky adherent tell us that Mekstroms had been predicted in the Bible. There are still people reporting flying saucers, you know. We have no time for foolish notions or utter nonsense. May I quote you? Of course not, he snapped stiffly. I'm merely pointing out that non-medical persons cannot have the grasp. The door opened again, and a second man entered. The new arrival had pleasant blue eyes, a Van Dyke beard, and a good-natured air of self-confidence and competence. May I cut in? He said to Dr. Sprague. Certainly. Mr. Cornell, this is Scholar Phelps, director of the center. Scholar Phelps, this is Mr. Steve Cornell, a gentleman of the press, he added in a tone of voice that made the identification a sort of nasty name. Mr. Cornell has an odd theory about Mekstrom's disease that he intends to publish unless we can convince him that it is not possible. Odd theory? Asked Scholar Phelps with some interest. Well, if Mr. Cornell can come up with something new, I'll be most happy to hear him out. Dr. Lyons Sprague decamped with alacrity. Scholar Phelps smiled after him, then turned to me and said, Dr. Sprague is a diligent worker, businesslike and well-informed, but he lacks the imagination and the sense of humor that makes a man brilliant in research. Unfortunately, Dr. Sprague cannot abide anything that is not laid out as neat as an interlocking tile floor. Now, Mr. Cornell, how about this theory of yours? First, I replied, I'd like to know how come you turned up in the nick of time. He laughed good-naturedly. We always send Dr. Sprague out to interview visitors. If the visitor can be turned away easily, all is well and quiet. Dr. Sprague can do the job with ease. But if the visitor, like yourself, Mr. Cornell, proposes something that distresses the good Dr. Sprague and will not be loftily dismissed, Dr. Sprague's blood pressure goes up. We all keep a bit of an esper on his nervous system, and when the fuse begins to blow, we come out and effect a double rescue. I laughed with him. Apparently, the medical center staff enjoyed needling Dr. Sprague. Scholar Phelps, before I get into my theory, I'd like to know more about Mekstrom's disease. I may not be able to use it in my article, but any background material works well with writers of fact articles. You're quite right. What would you like to know? I've heard too many times that no one knows anything at all about Mekstroms. This is unbelievable, considering that you folks have been working on it for some 20 years. He nodded. We have some, but it's precious little. It seems to me you could analyze the flesh. He smiled. We have. The state of analytical chemistry is well advanced. We could, I think, take a dry scraping out of the cauldron used by Macbeth's witches and determine whether Shakespeare had reported the formula correctly. Now, young man, if you think that something is added to the human flesh to make it Mekstrom's flesh, you are wrong. Standard analysis shows that the flesh is composed of exactly the same chemicals that normal flesh contains, in the same proportion. Nothing is added, as, for instance, in the case of calcification. Then what is the difference? The difference lies in the structure. By X-ray crystallographic method, we have determined that Mekstrom's flesh is a microcrystalline formation interlocked tightly. Scholar Phelps looked at me thoughtfully. Do you know much about crystallography? As a mechanical engineer, I did, but as a writer of magazine articles, I felt I should profess some ignorance. So I merely said that I knew a little about the subject. Well, Mr. Cornell, you may know that in the field of solid geometry there are only 5 possible regular polyhedrons. Like the laws of topology that state that no more than 4 colors need be used to print a map on a flat surface, or that no more than 7 colors are required to print separate patches on a toroid. The laws of solid geometry prove that no more than 5 regular polyhedrons are possible. Now, in crystallography, there are only 32 possible classes of crystal lattice construction. Of these, only 30 have ever been discovered in nature. Yet we know how the other 2 would appear if they did emerge in natural formation. I knew it all right, but I made scribblings in my notebooks as if the idea were of interest. Scholar Phelps waited patiently until I'd made the notation. Now, Mr. Cornell, here comes the shock. Mekstrom's flesh is one of the other 2 classes. This was news to me, and I blinked. Then his face faded into a solemn expression. Unfortunately, he said in a low voice, knowing how a crystal should form does not help us much in forming one to that class. We have no real control over the arrangement of atoms in a crystal lattice. We can prevent the crystal formation, we can control the size of the crystal as it forms, but we cannot change the crystal into some other class. I suppose it's sort of like baking a cake. Once the ingredients are mixed, the cake can be big or small or shaped to fit the pan, or you can spoil it completely. But if you mix devil's food, it either comes out devil's food or nothing. An amusing analogy, and rather correct. However, I prefer the one used years ago by Dr. Willy Ley, who observed that analysis is fine, but you can't learn how a locomotive is built by melting it down and analyzing the mess. Then he went on again. To get back to Mekstrom's disease and what we know about it, we know that the crawl goes at about a 64th of an inch per hour. If, for instance, you turned up here with a trace on your right middle finger, the entire first joint would be Mekstrom's flesh in approximately 3 days. Within 2 weeks, your entire middle finger would be solid. Without anesthesia, we could take a saw and cut off a bit for our research. No feeling? None whatever. The joints knit together, the arteries become as hard as steel tubing, and the heart cannot function properly. Not that the heart cares about minor conditions such as the arteries in the extremities, but as the Mekstrom infection crawls up the arm toward the shoulder, the larger arteries become solid, and then the heart cannot drive the blood through them in its accustomed fashion. It gets like an advanced case of arteriosclerosis. Eventually, the infection reaches and immobilizes the shoulder. This takes about 90 days. By this time, the other extremities have also become infected, and the crawl is coming up all 4 limbs. He looked at me very solemnly at that. The rest is not pretty. Death comes shortly after that. I can almost say that he is blessed who catches Mekstroms in the left hand. For them, the infection reaches the heart before it reaches other parts. Those whose initial infection is in the toes are particularly cursed because the infection reaches the lower parts of the body. I believe you can imagine the result. Elimination is prevented because of the stoppage of peristalsis. Death comes of autointoxication, which is slow and painful. I shuddered at the idea. The thought of death has always bothered me. The idea of looking at a hand and knowing that I was going to die by the calendar seemed particularly horrible. Taking the bit between my teeth, I said, "Scholar Phelps, I've been wondering whether you and your center have ever considered treating Mekstrom's by helping it." "Helping it?" he asked. "Sure. Consider what a man might be if he were Mekstrom's all the way through." He nodded. "You would have a physical superman," he said. "Steel-strong muscles driving steel-hard flesh, covered by a near-impenetrable skin. Perhaps such a man would be free of all minor pains and ills. Imagine a normal bacterium trying to bore into flesh as hard as concrete. Mekstrom flesh tends to be acid-resistant as well as tough physically. It is not beyond the imagination to believe that your Mekstrom Superman might live 3 times our frail 70, but... Here he paused. Not to pull down your house of cards, this idea is not a new one. Some years ago, we invited a brilliant young doctor here to study for his scholarate. The unfortunate fellow arrived with the first traces of Mekstroms in his right middle toe. We placed about 100 of our most brilliant researchers under his guidance, and he decided to take this particular angle of study. He failed. For all his efforts, he did not stay his death by a single hour. From that time to the present, we have maintained one group on this part of the problem. It occurred to me at that moment that if I turned up with a trace of Mekstroms, I'd be seeking out the highways in hiding rather than the medical center. That fast thought brought a second. Suppose that Dr. Thorndyke learned that he had a trace, or rather the highways found it out. What better way to augment their medical staff than to approach the victim with a proposition? You help us, work with us, and we will save your life. That, of course, led to the next idea, that if the highways in hiding had any honest motive, they'd not be hidden in the first place, and they'd have taken their cure to the medical center in the second. Well, I had a bit of something listed against them, so I decided to let my bombshell drop. Scholar Phelps, I said quietly, one of the reasons I am here is that I have fairly good evidence that the cure for Mekstrom's disease does exist, and that it produces people of ultra-hard bodies and superhuman strength. He smiled at me with the same tolerant air that a father uses on the offspring who comes up with one of the standard juvenile plans for perpetual motion. What do you consider good evidence? Suppose I claim to have seen it myself. Then I would say that you had misinterpreted your evidence, he replied calmly. The flying saucer enthusiasts still insist that the things they see are piloted by little green men from Venus, even though we have been there and found Venus to be absolutely uninhabited by anything higher than slugs, grubs, and little globby animals like Tellurian leeches. But this, too, is an old story, he told me with a whimsical smile. It goes with the standard routine about a secret organization that is intending to take over the Earth. The outline has been popular ever since Charles Fort. Now, just tell me what you saw. I concocted a tale that was about 33% true and the rest partly distorted. It covered my hitting a girl in Ohio with my car, hard enough to clobber her, but when I stopped to help her, she got up and ran away unhurt. She hadn't left a trace of blood, although the front fender of the car was badly smashed. He nodded solemnly. Such things happen, he said. The human body is really quite durable. Now and then comes the lucky happenstance when the fearful accident does no more than raise a slight bruise. I've read the story of the man whose parachute did not open and who lived to return it to the factory in person, according to the old joke. But now, Mr. Cornell, have you ever considered the utter impossibility of running any sort of secret organization in this world of today? Even before Rhine, it was difficult. You'll be adding to your tale next some sort of secret sign, maybe a form of fraternity grip, or perhaps even a worldwide system of local clubs and hangouts, all aimed at some dire purpose. I squirmed nervously for a bit. Scholar Phelps was too close to the truth to make me like it, because he was scoffing. He went right on making me nervous. Now, before we get too deep, I only want to ask about the probable motives of such an organization. You grant them superhuman strength, perhaps extreme longevity. If they wanted to take over the Earth, couldn't they do it by a show of force? Or are they mild-mannered supermen, only quietly interested in overrunning the human race and waiting out the inevitable decline of normal Homo sapiens? You're not endowing them with extraterrestrial origin, are you? I shook my head unhappily. Good. That shows some logic, Mr. Cornell. After all, we know now that while we could live on Mars or Venus with a lot of home-sent aid, we'd be most uncomfortable there. We could not live a minute on any planet of our solar system without artificial help. I might point out that our hypothetical Superman might be able to stand a lot of rough treatment, I blurted. Oh, this I'll grant if your tale held any water at all. But let's forget this fruitless conjecture and take a look at the utter impossibility of running such an organization. Even planting all their secret hangouts in dead areas and never going into urban centers, they'd still find some telepath or esper on their trail. Perhaps a team. Let's go back a step and consider, even without side training, how long such an outfit could function. It would run until the first specimen had an automobile accident on, say, Times Square, or until one of them walked, or ran, out of the fire following a jetliner crash. He then spared me with a cold eye. Write it as fiction, Mr. Cornell, but leave my name out of it. I thought you were after facts. I am, but the better fact articles always use a bit of speculation to liven it up. Well, he grunted. One such fanciful suggestion is the possibility of such an underground outfit being able to develop a cure while we cannot. We, who have had the best of brains and money for 20 years. I nodded, and while I did not agree with Phelps, I knew that to insist was to insult him to his face and get myself tossed out. You do seem to have quite a setup here, I said, offhand. At this point, Phelps offered to show me around the place, and I accepted. Medical Center was far larger than I had believed at first. It spread beyond my Esper range into the hills beyond the main plant. The buildings were arranged in a haphazard-looking pattern out in the back section. I say looking because only a psi-trained person can dig a pattern. The wide-open psi area did not extend for miles. Behind the main buildings, it closed down into the usual modeled pattern, and the medical buildings had been placed in the open areas. Dwellings and dormitories were in the dark places. A nice setup. I did not meet any of the patients, but Phelps let me stand in the corridor outside a couple of rooms and use my esper on the flesh. It was both distressing and instructive. He explained, "The usual thing after someone visits this way is that the visitor goes out itching. In medical circles, this is a form of what we call sophomore syndrome. Ever heard of it?" I nodded. That's during the first years at pre-med. Knowing all too little of medicine, every disease they study produces the same symptoms that the student finds in himself, until tomorrow when they study the next. Then the symptoms in the student change. Right. So in order to prevent sophomore syndrome among visitors, we usually let them study the real thing. Also, he added seriously, we'd like to have as many people as possible recognize the real thing as early as possible. Even though we can't do anything for them at the present time, someday we will. He stopped before a closed door. In here is a girl of 18, doomed to die in a month. His voice trailed off as he tapped on the door of the room. I froze. A few beads of cold sweat ran down my spine, and I fought myself into a state of nervous calmness. I put the observation away, buried it as deep as I could, tried to think around it, and so far as I knew, succeeded. The tap of Scholar Phelps' finger against the door panel was the rap, rap, rap sound characteristic of hard-tanned leather tapping wood. Scholar Phelps was a Mekstrom. I paid only surface attention to the rest of my visit. I thanked my personal gods that Esper training had also given me the ability to dissemble. It was impossible to not think of something, but it is possible to keep the mind so busy with surface thoughts that the underlying idea does not come through the interference. Eventually, I managed to leave the medical center without exciting anyone, and when I left, I took off like a skyrocket for Chicago. End of Chapter 6.